It wasn't going to be a piece of cake. I said that when Ban Ki moon was the United Nations Secretary General. The launch of the SDGs to innovate furthermore compared to the MDGs remained an idealist concept at the beginning of the 21st century and the third millennium. When Antonio Guterres succeeded to Ban Ki moon, I told him right then on Twitter that humanity is facing a daunting test in history. We always had the challenge of climate change that is becoming pressing by the day. Add to it the COVID 19 pandemic and the Russian Ukrainian conflicts. The conflict began on February the 20th, 2014. Its most critical parts over 3 months and so ago with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if I want to get back to this topic a little bit, as I told that during my past videos, but I had to have space in order to analyze furthermore the ongoing uh, events that are marking this invasion. I want to go back first to analyze the numbers. When it comes to the Russian army and the Ukrainian army, we can quickly notice that the Russian army is superior. In terms of soldiers, it's 900,000 soldiers versus 200,000. In terms of tanks, Russia has 3,417 tanks compared to the 987 of Ukraine. In terms of planes, the Russian Federation has 1,391 planes compared to only 124 for Ukraine. And finally, for attacking helicopters, 407 for Russia, 67 for Ukraine. The military budget of the Russian Federation is almost 10 times the one of the Ukrainians, $45.8 billion versus $4.27 billion for the government of Kiev. And compared lately the Russian invasion to the military intervention of the USSR in Afghanistan, and getting back here on the obstacles ahead for the Russians. First, they can't know how to move in Ukraine when it comes to land battles better than the Ukrainians. In order for them to invade north, they must overcome a corridor of cities from west to east: Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kryvyi Rih, Zaporizhia, and Dnipro. Then, a second corridor south of Kiev from west to east: Chernivtsi, Khmelnytsky, Vinnytsia, Cherkasy, Poltava, and Kharkiv. Another factor is that the Russian army is lacking techniques of sky control, despite the superior number of planes and helicopters compared to Ukraine, as I mentioned earlier. Russian bombs aren't of a good quality and precision. The Russian must therefore fly lower in order to be precise, which makes them vulnerable to the Ukrainian defense system. Also, inland, the Russian army is trained mostly to fight in vast spaces, which is something that is in the advantage of the Ukrainian. Especially that the Ukrainian territory rarely offers these vast spaces. When it comes to battlefronts in cities, the soldiers cannot use tanks and must deploy. The current conflict shows and reflects a reality that is basically consisting on the lack of organization in terms of coordination between officers and soldiers, translating a fact about the Russian army that have been existing for many years, which is the poor training of land officers. There is also the bad management of the Russian trucks on the road, which leaves them at the mercy of Ukrainian drones. On the other side, the Ukrainian resistance see the fruits of the increase on the budget when it comes to training reserve soldiers ever since the conflict started de facto in 2014. Historically, we've seen the United States in Vietnam. Now this: لا تحقرن صغيرا في مخاصمته إن البعوضة تدمي مقلة الأسد. For the economic standpoint, as I mentioned, this war will have catastrophic consequences when it comes to energy. I speak here about oil, natural gas, coal, fossil energy. Russia always exported its gas ever since the days of the Cold War. Now we have new data. When the United States European Union slams Russia with unprecedented economic sanctions. Putin was clear regarding natural gas. You buy, you pay immediately. Long story short. We saw what happened already in Poland and Bulgaria. Amid the circumstance, some countries accepted to pay Russia's national gas in rubles. With this pace, Russia still has the credit to lead the war for 1.5 years to 5 years, margin of error included. I want to ask President Zelensky why there is a lobby to stop buying the Russian natural gas from the European countries while Ukraine still purchases it as of 2022. Or simply who gives that script to Zelensky? Go figure. The reality is that there is an oil and energy crisis that started before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Moreover, with environmental preconization, it has become difficult to prospect R&D wise when it comes to fossil energy. I see where Donald Trump is coming from when he speaks about this. Shale gas can be therefore sold by the United States to the European markets. I'll be very objective here. At the expense of the risk presented by this type of gas, despite its containing methane, like the Russian natural gas. It requires their purification and compression from both sides, the United States and Europe. But it will cost arms and legs. The American diplomacy showed its inability to manage foreign relations after the fiasco of Afghanistan when it comes to the status quo in this conflict. Moreover, it's unwise to threaten the People's Republic of China. Also, in another context, if you look at NATO, at the United Nations Security Council work during the month of May, there is no lesson to give to the world, yet the neoliberal still argues without logic with the universal. Avoiding the worst is avoiding World War III and the nuclear war. Given the state of the world in May 2022, that's the main concern of my counterterrorism work. So when I speak about these matters, I joined several voices ahead of the 10th Review Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT conference, with the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, alongside the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Impacts of Nuclear Weapons and the ICAN Nuclear Ban Forum in Vienna as well. Always we come back to the human mistake and throughout history and what have we learned from history at the end of the day. Can we answer this question? So we have to focus on strategies to reinforce the arms control and non-proliferation system, including, like I said, the NPT review conference, the impact of new and disruptive weapons technology, and how basically we can rejuvenate the public engagements and action for nuclear disarmament. Now I'm going to move to a topic that is very related, the counterterrorism, speaking about the terrorism index of 2022, getting back here onto a summary. Like I said, I want to go back and review in general the scope by analyzing the global terrorism index maps, the terrorist incident map, terrorism in general in 2021, how has COVID-19 impacted terrorism, a definition of the terrorist groups, and the 10 countries that are most impacted by terrorism. Also, very important when we speak about trends in terrorism in 2022 to analyze the ideological trends in the West and basically the regional trends. There is also the question of the terrorism in the Sahel, a very critical area in the world. Here we have to analyze terrorism in the Sahel context, the ecological threats and terrorism in the Sahel, and the regional case studies. I want to get back furthermore by analyzing this report about the issue of terrorism and conflict by analyzing three main points. Terrorism and insurgency, correlates of terrorism and disrupting terrorist groups and networks. By looking also at the experts' contributors, the technology of terror from dynamite to the metaverse, the sub-Saharan Africa at crossroads. I will be focusing on the third point when it comes to the contribution of experts, why Morocco's counter-terrorism evolution matters in Africa. So if we want to get back here, we have to understand that in 2021, the deaths from terrorism fell by 1.2% to 7,142 deaths and are now a third of what they were at their peak in 2015. The minor fall in deaths was mirrored by a reduction in the impact of terrorism, with 86 countries recording an improvement compared to 19 that deteriorated. However, the number of attacks globally increased by 17% to 5,226. As such, the lethality of attacks decreased by 1.6 deaths per attack to 1.4 deaths per attack over the 12 months period. Russia and Eurasia had the largest regional improvements. The number of countries experiencing at least one death from terrorism in the past year was 44, a slight increase compared with 43 countries in 2020. Another 105 countries had no deaths or attacks from terrorism in 2021. This is the highest number of countries since 2007. Again, let's remind that this is the data at the end of 2021. So this data shows a shift in the dynamics of terrorism, with it's becoming more concentrated in regions and countries suffering from political instabilities and conflicts such as the Sahel, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. Violent conflict remains a primary driver of terrorism, with over 97% of terrorist attacks in 2021 taking place in countries in conflicts. All of the 10 countries most impacted by terrorism in 2021 were involved in an armed conflict in 2020. Attacks in countries involved in conflicts are 6 times deadlier than attacks in peaceful countries. There were serious deterioration in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, especially the Sahel. 48% or 3,461 of all terrorism deaths globally occurred in the region, with 4 of the 10 countries with the largest increases in death from terrorism residing therein: Burkina Faso, the DRC, Mali, and Niger. 3 of these countries are in the Sahel. On a more positive note, there was a 10% improvement in terrorism deaths in the Sahel. The improvement can be attributed to the successful counterinsurgency operations targeting Boko Haram, where deaths caused by the group declined by 72% between 2020 and 2021. From 629 deaths to 178. Nigeria recorded the second biggest reduction in deaths. This is more than the overall decrease in terrorism deaths in the Sahel. Attacks by the group also significantly decreased, halving from the prior year to 64 attacks. The Sahel is of serious concern. The expansion of Islamic State's affiliates led to a surge in terrorism in many countries in the Sahel, highlighting therefore the magnitude of the problem. Terrorism deaths have risen by over 1,000% between 2007 and 2021 in the Sahel. Terrorism deaths in Niger more than doubled in 2020, rising to 588. Deaths attributed to Islamic extremist groups such as the Islamic State in West Africa, the ISWA, Jama'at Nasr al-Islam wal Muslimin, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab recorded deaths as far south as Mozambique, with 43% occurring in the Sahel. The situation in the Sahel is rapidly deteriorating with 8 attempted coups in Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and Chad in the last 18 months. The underlying drivers are complex and systemic, including poor water utilization, lack of food, malnutrition, strong population growth, and weak governments, with most of the terrorist activities occurring along borders where government control is weakest. Adding to the complexity, many criminal organizations increasingly represent themselves as Islamic insurgents. The JNIM, the one I mentioned earlier, which is Jama'at Nasr al-Islam wal-Muslimin, is the fastest growing group globally, recording the largest increase in the number of attacks and deaths in 2021. It was responsible for 351 deaths in 2021, an increase of 69%. In contrast, ISWA is the most lethal group in the Sahel, with the group responsible for an average 15.2 deaths per attack in Niger. In the West, the number of attacks has fallen substantially over the last 3 years, with successive falls each year. 59 attacks and 10 deaths were recorded in 2021, a decrease of 68 to 70% respectively since the peak in 2018. In Europe, Islamist extremists carried out 3 attacks in 2021. Politically motivated terrorism has now overtaken religiously motivated terrorism, with the latter declining by 82% in 2021. In the last 5 years, there have been 5 times more politically motivated terrorist attacks than religiously motivated attacks. Since 2007, 17% of terrorist attacks by these groups have targeted this category. Additionally, while this motivation can be inferred, most attacks attributed to left or right ideologies are perpetrated by individuals or groups with no formal affiliation to a recognized organization, with many of the underlying motivational factors being similar. The Islamic State remained the deadliest terror group globally, recording the most attacks and deaths of any group in 2021. However, globally, 52% of all terrorist incidents are not ascribed to a group. Despite this, the strength of influence of the Islamic State and its affiliates groups, Islamic State of Khorasan Province, the ISKP, the Islamic State of the Sinai Province, the ISSP, and the ISWA, as I mentioned, are showing signs of decline. 20 countries experienced the death from terrorism caused by Islamic States in 2021, a decrease from 26 countries the year prior. Deaths attributed to Islamic States also declined in 2021, falling by 1.6% to 2,066. Deaths in the Middle East and North Africa dropped by 13% to 1,139 fatalities, the lowest since 2007, although attacks remain steadily at 1,271. Therefore, terrorist attacks are becoming less deadly in the region, with less than 1 person killed on average per terrorist attack in 2021, the lowest lethality rate in the last decade. In contrast, SSA and South Asia recorded more deaths than MENA. The reports that I studied looks also at the relationship between insurgency, conflict, and terrorism, as well as the application of systems thinking to better understand the dynamics of terrorism and its impact on society. Once groups exist for more than 12 years, they are very hard to stop. In contrast to this, over half of all terrorist groups do not survive beyond 3 years. This emphasizes the need to focus counterterrorism operations while the groups are still nascent. Myanmar had the largest increase in terrorism deaths, rising 20-fold from 24 to 521 in 2021. This year marks Myanmar's first appearance amongst the 10 most impacted countries by terrorism, with the current political unrest being responsible for this increase and is likely to grow during this year. Niger recorded the second largest increase in terrorism deaths, increasing by 129% to 588, while attacks remained consistent. The increased instability is largely driven by the growing sophistication and organizational capabilities of ISWA. Mozambique recorded the largest drop in terrorism deaths with 414 fewer deaths in 2021, an 82% decrease from the previous year. The fall was driven by successful counterterrorism measures against the Islamic States performed by the Mozambican forces in conjunction with Rwanda and the Southern African Development Community. South Asia remains the region with the worst average GTI score in 2021, with the region recording 1,829 deaths from terrorism in 2021, an increase of 8% to 137 deaths. Pakistan remains one of the 10 most affected countries in 2021. Terrorism deaths in Pakistan rose slightly to 275, a 5% increase from 263 deaths in 2020. There have been no terrorist attacks or deaths in Sri Lanka for the second year. The worst year for terrorism was 2019, when 197 people were killed in 11 attacks. So as new technologies has become more pervasive, so has their use by terrorist organizations. The advent of the IED in Iraq is a good example and resulted in more than 70% of US forces deaths in the 5 years from 2001. Smartphones using GPS systems are capable of guiding cheap drones with deadly precision, with attacks missiles and drones becoming more common. Advancements such as AI, 3D printing, and autonomous vehicles may in the future be weaponized. These new risks will drive future advancements in counterterrorism tactics. The factors that are most closely statistically associated with terrorism vary depending on the socio-economic development of a country. Political terror and acceptance of basic rights are common globally. For the OECD countries, there are two statistical clusters. There are measures associated with social equity and acceptance of violence within a society, the latter being associated with political terror, access to weapons, and militarization. For less economically developed countries, the statistical clusters are weak. Institutions and societal fractionalization analysis. The two strongest correlation for this group were political terror scale and group grievances. The decline of terrorism in the West coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic. Restrictions on freedom of movement, public gatherings, travel, and an immediate threat to personal health may have helped to explain some of this fall. Once the emergency measures are removed and societies begin to live with the COVID-19, there is the possibility for an uptake in terrorism activity. This would require addressing the underlying issue of alienation. Of course, we're going to follow up with this topic throughout 2022. So why Morocco's counterterrorism evolution matters to Africa? So getting back here to following with the 2003 Casablanca attacks, since then Morocco began a profound transformation of the kingdom's counterterrorism strategy. In the immediate aftermath, legislators and policymakers confronted national security challenges, including enhancing security for potential vulnerable targets and addressing conditions conducive to terrorism and violent extremism. Outlining some of Morocco's noteworthy changes in the country's counterterrorism approach since 2003 and measures results against the current African terrorism landscape is very important to highlight. In addition, it details how the newly opened UNOCT Program Office of Counterterrorism and Training in Rabat will aid developing, strengthening, and advancing law enforcement and the whole of the society counterterrorism response for the African continent. So to remind the attacks of May 16, 2003 in Casablanca, there were 12 members of Al-Salafiyya Al-Jihadiyya, a Salafi jihadi terrorist organization affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. attacked the Farah Hotel, the Jewish community center, a Jewish restaurant, a Jewish cemetery, and the Spanish social club. The selection of targets suggested that terrorists wanted to destroy the symbols of Morocco's religious tolerance and modernity. The attacks left 45 people dead, including 12 suicide terrorists, and wounded 100. Although considered small and unsophisticated compared to other international terrorist operations, the five bombings left an indelible mark on the country's psyche. The attacks marked the introduction of suicide terrorism in Morocco, represented the expansion of the Al-Qaeda terrorist threats to Morocco, and the end of the belief that the country was immune to the political trends in the Arab Middle East because of its Sunni heritage and open approach to Islam. It is believed that the planning for the attacks began in November 22 in areas of Casablanca that are considered to be hard to police, with high unemployment and illiteracy rates. Within weeks, terrorists recruited a group of young men and introduced them to suicide terrorism training material. Once indoctrinated, recruits undertook physical conditioning training in the proximity of the area where they live in Casablanca, produced also a small batch of explosives and tested them at a cemetery before embarking on large-scale production. With May 16 in sight, the terrorists prepared for the attacks by watching videos evocative of the awaited afterlife. Having prayed and promised to meet again in paradise, they began the first stage of their operation. In the lead up to the May 16th, Morocco had already experienced a sharp increase in terrorist operations against civilians. However, most of those operations did not involve explosive or suicide terrorism. The Casablanca attacks set in motion a new wave of internationally inspired domestic terrorism that would be eventually attested by the 2007 and 2015 Casablanca attacks, the 2011 attacks in Marrakesh, as well as the 2018 attacks in Imlil. The 2003 Casablanca and subsequent attacks prompted the Moroccan government to enhance its counter-terrorism policy to address changing terrorist tactics, accelerated operational tempo, and increased lethality. Basically, law passed 2 weeks after the 2003 attacks, becoming the first series of legislative reforms enhancing Morocco's legal counterterrorism framework. Law expanding the definition of terrorism to include incitement. It introduced sentencing in line with the classification of terrorism as a major crime for active participation in terrorist-related activities, including a minimum of 10-year sentence in addition to the duration of police custody in cases of terrorism, and enhanced both intelligence gathering and counterterrorism investigating procedures. The Moroccan government also recognized that the 2003 attacks required a comprehensive response that went beyond legal reform. While many blamed economic and social conditions for the attacks, the nature of the attacks galvanized the will of the entire country to reject and combat terrorism. At the government level, the attacks exposed the need for improved security of vulnerable or soft targets and tighter monitoring of suspects to impede the movements of terrorists and in and out of the country. There was a need for improved border management and a better trained and equipped law enforcement and security forces. Within the framework of its preventive approach, the country embarked on implementing what experts and analysts often refer to as a tri-dimensional counterterrorism strategy that is largely but not exclusively aimed at addressing different components of the terrorist threat through security, socioeconomic development, as well as supporting the religious field. So if we see this scope from beneficiary to contribution, Morocco's multi-dimensional response has proven effective even if the nature of the threat has meant it was not possible to prevent all terrorist attacks or the damage they caused to the tourism sector, for instance. Nevertheless, Results suggest that despite more than 1,000 Moroccan nationals joining the Islamic State and the other terrorist groups in war zones, the country dismantled more than 200 terrorist cells and made more than 3,500 terrorism related arrests over the past 2 decades, thereby possibly avoiding more than 300 planned terrorist actions. While no country can defeat terrorism with just arrests, Morocco's law enforcement actions have undoubtedly weakened terrorist organizations in the country while reducing the appeal of violent extremism at home. It's reorganized its religious sector to counter terrorist narratives and recruitment, adopted a proactive national security strategy, and updated its legislative and regulatory text, strengthening by the occasion its state agencies in charge of security, human development, and international cooperation. It has spearheaded the integration of women in Morocco's prevention and countering of violent extremism conducive to terrorism in terms of efforts, which are now seen as a best practice in the Arab world. The kingdom also became much more active in multilateral counter-terrorism activities, such as joining the Global Coalition to defeat ISIS and co-chairing the Foreign Terrorist Fighter Working Group of the Global Counterterrorism Forum, whose The Hague Marrakesh Memorandum was the basis of the landmark of UN Security Council Resolution 2178 of 2014. In 2015, it went on to take over the role of the GCTF co-chair and to form a group of friends to counter terrorism at the United Nations. Morocco's active role in fighting terrorism suggests the country's understanding of the threats, the interconnectedness of its counterterrorism methods, the application of combined soft and hard measures, the facilitation of information sharing practices, and the promotion of international cooperation as the sine qua non of counterterrorism. Besides being a member of the GCTF and the Global Coalition, Morocco has aligned closely with the US and European counterterrorism efforts. For example, the United States holds an annual joint exercise in Morocco, Tunisia, and Senegal known as African Lion to increase in the interoperability with international partners and counter malign activities in North Africa and Southern Europe. More recently, Morocco has also shared intelligence that helped lead to the arrest of terrorists or foil attacks in France, Belgium, India, Italy, Spain, Germany, Burkina Faso, and Sri Lanka. Morocco's domestic and regional PCVE efforts, such as its Imam training program, have also been widely promoted and earned respect amongst European countries as possible models for other parts of the broader Middle East and North African region. Such integration and evolution of both hard and soft approaches to counterterrorism have cemented the country's close cooperation with other countries, including its neighboring countries of the Sahel and West Africa regions. There is no room for complacency. Morocco's counterterrorism arrangements, capacities, and commitments have catapulted the country into a different sphere. Unsurprisingly, many see the kingdom as a strong international counterterrorism partner, playing a vital role in ensuring and promoting Africa's peace, security, and stability. But as the continent confronts a dramatic change in the scope, pace, and proximity of the terrorist threats, neither Morocco nor the rest of the continent can afford to rest on its laurels. With 41% of all IS-related attacks globally, Africa replaced the Middle East as the epicenter of the global terrorist threat. Today we must focus on what seems to be almost universal agreement amongst academics, policymakers, and practitioners that decades of Western-backed efforts have not succeeded in blunting the spread of terrorism in Africa, whether inspired by Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, or other local groups. This is partly because the terrorism landscape in Africa has changed in a post-colonial period from one marked mostly by violent extremist groups focused mostly on local objectives to one in which local groups have increasingly aligned themselves and become networked with global terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and Islamic States, with their senior leaders subject to intense insecurity pressure in the core. These groups have themselves had to move from pyramidal and centralized command and control, therefore, structures to more networked and decentralized models. This has made local terrorist affiliations to global terrorist networks a trend and a lifeline to increased support, expertise, funding, recruitment, and reputational standing. Operationally, closer and stronger links between long-lived insurgencies, opportunistic transnational criminals, and violent extremists have improved terrorist groups' prospects of survival while diminishing the long-term effects of military action against them. Today, the African terrorist terrain is now more crowded than 4 decades ago. These groups are reported to have been responsible for the deaths of 12,500 people in 2020, showing that terrorist attacks are both more frequent and lethal than previously. Terrorist violence both feeds and exacerbates the increased political instability in West Africa and the Sahel, complicating the efforts to address the underlying socio-economic and humanitarian conditions that are conducive to violent extremism. Regrettably, more than 20 years after 9/11, the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban is bringing back the nightmare through that global jihadi terrorist groups may once again find a safe haven where they can basically reorganize and thrive. To look at this one way forward, like the Kingdom has planned, looking ahead, a comprehensive response particularly aimed at addressing the need for enhanced counterterrorism investigative capacities is a good starting point for consideration. No country in Africa, let alone around the globe, will arrest itself out of the rising threat of terrorism. But without strong counterterrorism law enforcement-led interventions, the fight is not likely to succeed. Moroccan law enforcement successes in thwarting attacks while adopting responses that observe the rule of law, providing a good example for the rest of the continent and the Arab region. Morocco's recent signing of a host country agreement with the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, like I said, to establish a program office for counterterrorism and training in Africa, offers one way forward. The University in Rabat was officially inaugurated on June the 24th, 2021, with the support and in close cooperation with the Kingdom. The permanent office in Rabat has been established as a specialized training center for the African security, law enforcement, and judicial communities. Since its opening, the office has developed a multi-level training curriculum with basically foundational, intermediate, advanced, and training the trainer levels to build basically specialized technical capacities to member states in Africa. Since many of the countries in West Africa lack the resources to provide their own specialized counterterrorism training, the University in Rabat offers a program that is focused on delivering counterterrorism capacity building programs on 5 main specialized areas: counterterrorism investigations, border security management, preventing and combating violent extremism, prison management, and prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration. This curriculum also provides for the trainer and higher level courses as means of helping beneficiary countries sustaining their enhanced capacities over the long term. Morocco, along with University, envisages indeed that capacity building to these 5 areas will provide a stepping stone for African countries to build more sustainable, compliant, and effective law enforcement responses to the continent's evolving terrorist threats. So, in order to summarize, Morocco's active role in fighting terrorism suggests the country's understanding of the threat, the interconnectedness of its counterterrorism methods, the application of combined and soft and hard measures, the facilitation of information sharing practices, and the promotion of international cooperation, as I said, as the sine qua non of counterterrorism. Moving now to the United States, my focus is continuously on executive counterterrorism in terms of governance. I want to talk here onto the context of red teaming, analyzing the alternative analysis and risk assessment for a changing world. While I'm working onto this draft, I think the five important things to highlight when we speak about this context of action is first red teaming techniques, then alternative analysis, third diagnostic and calibration techniques, fourth argument mapping, and finally pre-mortem risk assessments. While basing my efforts with the American top business sphere on putting in place direct democracy, a work that will take a long time and patience, I should remind that I ran for precincts and won in 2014 in Ohio. And let me be more clear and more fair with you to show you how much I believe in democracy and the chances to the others, unlike so many. This will be probably my last race for a very, very long time. My focus right now is just with the American top business, mainly on supporting races that will help us within this project of developing direct democracy. From the federal to the local spheres, why not? I work on federal and state level when it comes to New York and New Jersey and governance, but when it comes to politics, from the nationwide aspect, which is different than federal, I'm ready to work with the federal to the local spheres. Long story short. Like I said before, time is against us in a conjuncture of emergency, and the fact that COVID-19 even relegated politics to a secondary level. During the 2020s, we must hold candidates and elected to establish a sort of town hall between quotes type of discussions. They must agree to sign affidavits in this context of action. This is just a draft program for now, in order to make sure they participate in these types of town halls even after being elected. And before being elected, we do not need these debates between different candidates. We need more town hall meetings where the candidate meets the people, if I may. That's it for now. I cannot disclose every point I discuss with the American top business and others, the sponsors. But besides reforming and rebuilding the United States politics, there is the issue of election integrity that must be looked upon. It's about putting a phase of comprehensive task force nationwide, and this will be over the mid and long term. It will take a village, but things must change at all costs. If I have to speak about some specificities of the United States politics that could take place in the 2020s, I can focus maybe on the fact that it could be a third major political formation in this country with Donald Trump. The other point is also looking furthermore at the Senate Congress elections, federally, statewide, as much as one looks at individual tickets running, in order to have a better understanding within the town halls of what we can get from idea A to build idea B. Like I said a few minutes ago, from a nationwide scope, focusing on the federal level and how Washington DC works, and also some states. Like I said, there is a focus on governance, but as well in politics for New York and New Jersey, as well as Texas right now with all the critical ongoing events, and also in California, looking forward to the housing crisis in California and the issue that is related basically of the housing supply with the California Senate Bill 9 and Senate Bill 10. A lot of things to look forward in September, and events that will take place respectively therein in San Francisco, Sacramento, Fresno, Riverside, Los Angeles, and San Diego in this context of action. Also from a local perspective, mostly focusing on the New York City, which I call a mega local sphere, emerging while working for change for a very long term. If my group says you're out, you're out. There's a lot of events that I will get back into through the next days, months, because I will speak about them in my Twitter feedback, also on other videos, including the ones of YouTube. Looking forward furthermore to conversations with the United Nations Security Council briefings, the MENA Youth Forum that will take place in Morocco, the virtual launch of exploring the use of technology for remote ceasefire monitoring and verification by UNIDIR. Also this month, the first meeting of the states parties to the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that will take place in Vienna, and the conclusion of the Guichero case in The Hague at the level of the International Criminal Courts. We also have important elections with the United Nations Security Council here, the permanent members that will be elected for 2023 and 2024. The Libya presidential elections that were postponed from December 2021 is also a topic to follow. I won't be in touch really with the high-level political forum, but it's not really touching the counterterrorism objectives that I'm looking forward. In July, there is the ICC's 20th anniversary that will take place in The Hague, as well as the Cyber Stability Conference that will be hosted by UNIDIR. I will follow up in August with the 10th review conference, of course, of the parties to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons at the United Nations, the annual stakeholder meeting of Tesla 2022 in Austin, Texas. Looking forward also when it's confirmed for the World Conference of Intercultural and Interfaith Dialogue in St. Petersburg, Russia, the P5 Summit, the Post-Pandemic Preparedness and Response Conference, as well as the second ministerial meeting on peacekeeping in the Francophone countries. These both last events will take place in Morocco, the latter being in partnership with France. All this ahead of the General Assembly in September, always reviewing, because time flies by really fast, what we have been speaking about during the last General Assembly and what I have been basically presenting on September 30th, 2021. So stay tuned, much more to come, and let's get busy.